after the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, after the First Opium War and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking and a large number of other treaties which followed. And all these treaties were humiliating treaties from the standpoint of China. Now, there was a transformation in the character of Chinese society and Chinese economy. China, which was feudal in the earlier period, now became transformed into a into a feudal and semi-colonial country. One important aspect was that the influence of Western powers was felt on different branches of Chinese society. On the other hand, there was a popular reaction, intense, bitter popular reaction, which manifested itself into rebellions. There were major rebellions, no doubt. We have the Taiping Rebellion, followed by the Nian Rebellion, and then the Boxer Rebellion. Now, apart from these rebellions, there were also a series of small outbreaks, riots, bread riots, different types. People got united, and all of them were more or less vocal against Manchu rule because they felt that their surrender, their subservience to the foreign powers was the root cause of all the evils that they have been facing, all the ills they had been suffering from. And in the face of such a situation, later Qing rulers, at that time there was the Empress dowager, Tzu-hsi. She was at the helm of affairs, and her clique. They felt that some concessions should be made to all the disgruntled, not all, but as many disgruntled elements as possible, so that they could save their regime from total destruction. The situation at the turn of the 19th century was very much unfavorable for the Empress Dowager Tzu-hsi. This ruling clique was totally isolated from the people, all sections of people, not only from the common people, but also from their own people, their own supporters. In fact, many of them, many landlords, the bourgeois elements, of course, they were comprador bourgeois. Now, comprador bourgeoisie, the landlord elements, the militaries, who constituted the main support base of the Qing rule or the Manchu rule, many of them also became dissatisfied with the performance of the Qing rulers in the last years of their rule. Now, that was one thing. The other part was, of course, the revolutionary elements within Chinese society. Yat-sen was very active. He had already formed his revived China society, Xing-chung-hui. He was trying to organize rebellions, secret society rebellions, to overthrow Manchu rule, because he believed that unless we overthrow the Manchus and we set up a republican government in China, there could be no end to all the ills that China had been suffering from. Foreign powers, they had already realized that the Manchu rulers were very weak. So foreign powers felt that they could do anything they liked with the Manchu rulers because they were so weak. Economic condition in China also was very precarious. Yiho-tuan movement was suppressed. Yiho-tuan movement was one of the biggest rebellions of modern China, peasant rebellions in modern China. And naturally, a lot of money was spent by the Manchu rulers. That was one thing. And then there was the signing of the Protocol of 1901, and where a huge amount of indemnity, apart from other things, was extracted from the Manchu government. Now, in the meantime, in 1898, there was a reform movement, which is also called the 100 Days Reform. Actually, it was 103 days. And the reforms were quashed by the Manchu rulers. But those reforms demanded reconsideration in the new situation after 1900. New sources of revenue were to be procured to pay off the indemnities, interest on loans. Huge amount of loan was taken from foreign powers, various foreign financial cliques, financial cartels, and so that had to be paid. And then there should be stabilization of it. There should be an administrative stabilization throughout the country. In the meantime, Sun Yat-sen had been attempting his uprisings. The Boxers had also attempted rebellion, no doubt about it. Now, all those movements were suppressed, but none of those movements were dead. The movements were very much alive. Actually, it could never be suppressed because it went on raising throughout this period. In fact, the forces of change were very strong at that time. The Manchu rulers realized that some concessions should be given to hold down, to forestall any revolutionary overthrow of their already tottering regime. They must be saved from disaster. Another thing is that there are many elements belonging to the ruling clique, such as the landlords, such as the comprador bourgeoisie, such as the militaries, who had foreign links. They're very much linked up, tied up with foreign powers. And this section was led by a general known as Yuan Shikai, Yuan Shikai or Yuan Shikai. It was this total situation which demanded that some reforms, important reforms, should be carried out, should be introduced by the government, by the Empress, dowager Tzu-hsi, as also others, if they are to save themselves from imminent doom. There was an imperial edict which was issued on 30th August 1900. In that imperial edict, the government referred in general terms to the needs for reform. In April 1901, a committee for matters on government was formed, and it was the chief conductor of what they described as a new policy, quote unquote new policy. It was this committee which sought opinion from different quarters, sought memorials from different quarters, petitions or recommendations, suggestions from different quarters. And it was the task of the committee to decide on the recommendations. On the basis of all these recommendations, it was decided that reforms should be initiated in such sectors as foreign affairs, judiciary, police, army, commerce, education, and administration. These are the sectors. Now, again, an imperial decree was passed, and a Ministry of Foreign Affairs was set up, which was modeled on the European pattern. In China, before it was set up, there was an archaic central office which was in charge of foreign relations, but it was abolished, and so we have the formation of a new Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the main aim of the new policy was to gain support of foreign powers, because it was a step towards modernization. It was a step on the Western model. In the final protocol of 1901, there was a special clause, clause 12, and it was on the basis of this clause 12 that there was a formation of a foreign ministry. In the earlier system of Chinese judiciary, we have a very barbarian and outdated methods of investigation and cruel torture. Prisoners were tortured. And it was felt that it should be reorganized, remodeled, again on the Western model. A police force was, of course, necessary. It was connected with this, with the judiciary, to re-establish peace and order. And so a Ministry of Police was also constituted in 1905. Now, a group of officials were appointed to formulate recommendations for the reform of the judiciary. And the barbarian methods of investigation, barbarian methods of torture, cruel torture, these were abolished in 1902 and 1903. A new type of police force again was set up in 1905, and it was named the Ministry of the Interior. That ministry was introduced in 1906, and accordingly the police forces in all the big cities were restructured. Army, as you know, is the most important element of the state machinery, the standing army. The modernization of the army was very essential if the new state was to stand on a solid foundation. The Manchu court and the committee for matters on government, they counted on the army reform to strengthen their position. And in fact, the bulk, the major portion of the funds that was being shifted to the development of the army. And the primary object was the modernization of the army to increase its efficiency. And another important thing is that in the earlier period, there were only regional armies, provincial armies, but now we have a national army in China. In 1901, the viceroys and the governors, they were instructed to disband inefficient units of the army. New army was formed along European and Japanese lines. In the earlier period, there was an examination for army officials, which was described as archaic, such as there was weightlifting test, archery test, which belonged to bygone days, old days, ancient days. Now, naturally, these were not applicable to the modern period, so all these things were abolished. And military academies were set up in different parts. In all these army reforms activities, Yuan Shikai played an important role. And it was he who was instrumental in introducing the new system of structuring the armed forces. There was the formation of irregular infantry and garrison troops. It was declared that by 1912 and 1913, there would be 36 divisions of the new army. Yes, it would be a mercenary army. Like all armies, it would be a mercenary army. But all army men should be able to read and write, which was not there in the earlier period. Each of them should have some property status. Property status was essential. And each of them required a letter of introduction from some person of substance, from some important officials, whose recommendation, of course, was acceptable to the government. And in 1906, an army ministry was set up by amalgamating the board of war and the military academies. Despite these attempts, some criticisms have been leveled by historians, particularly Cambridge historians, against these measures, particularly army measures. They argue that the bulk of the army men came from a floating population, not the literate people, but from a floating population who were evicted from their homes and lands. And literate people were generally not in the picture. There must have been some literate people, but that was not the general picture. Now, to reorganize the army, a problem cropped up, and that is to reorganize the army, provincial support was essential. But the fact is that the Manchu rulers were forming a national army, a central army, not a provincial army. So, if they formed a national army, central army, then that would go against provincial interests. But to form a national army, they were to depend on provincial financial support. So naturally, it was very difficult to get financial support from different provinces because people knew that the army raised thereby would not be a provincial army, but a central army, which would not cater to their interests. So it was a crisis, and the Manchu rulers did not know how to overcome this crisis. It was very difficult. The Manchu rulers also introduced a policy of sending Chinese students, military students abroad, particularly to Japan, to have training in their military academies. And they were financed by the government. Now, these students also started questioning the legality of Manchu rule itself, questioning such a policy. So problems cropped up from different quarters, despite attempts made by the central government. Now, money was absolutely essential, so there should be the development of commerce. The government should change its attitude towards the bourgeoisie. Some changes were essential to procure money, particularly from the bourgeoisie. In 1903, a Ministry of Commerce was established, again by an imperial edict, and steps were taken to encourage investments in industry and trade. Special officials were appointed in the provinces to give license to the merchants and the industrialists. In 1903 and 1904, the court published regulations governing the chambers of commerce and industry in provincial seats and bigger cities. And a foundation for commercial industrial legislation was also laid thereby. They also had, the merchants also now could be conferred titles and offices, which was not there in the earlier period. Now, the Chinese system of education till then was based on Confucian learning. Now, that system was discontinued from 1905. That is a system which continued for a period of about 24-25 centuries, was discontinued during this period of later Ching Reforms. And in place of the old system, we have a new civil service examination, which emphasized the political history of China as also the Western science. These were two important components of the new civil service examination, which was not there in the earlier period. In the earlier period, we have the essay system examination. They called it eight-legged essays on Confucian morality. Now, that was discontinued. Now, in September 1901, there was again a decree on education. It was decided that there should be three grades: the primary, secondary, and the higher grade. And the graduates of the secondary and the higher grades, they were entitled to serve in official positions. At one point of time, both the system, old and the new system, continued for some years. And after that, the new system was introduced. An academy, an old academy, known as the Hanlin Academy, which supplied the court with top rank officials. They now were required to pay attention to practical and natural sciences in order to meet the needs of the court, the needs of the government. And in 1905 was formed a Ministry of Education, and gifted young men, they were sent abroad at state expense to get higher education. Again, some scholars, particularly of the Cambridge School, they argue that the fact that the Chinese abandoned the Confucian system of education, it implied a revolution in the political attitude and values. And the Confucian system, but the important point is that if we call, yes, there was a change in the realm of superstructure. There is no doubt about it. But to introduce a reform in a particular field, to introduce an act is one thing. But to have changes, fundamental changes taking place in the minds of the people is another. And even though from 1905, a change was introduced, fundamental change was introduced in the realm of superstructure, the system, the Confucian influence was very much there. And this is attested by the fact, by the events that took place during the May 4th movement of 1919. Even during the Cultural Revolution of 1960s, when Confucian ideology was attacked, in the May 4th movement, girls, school and college girls, they took to the streets and raised the slogans, "Down with Confucius" and so on. So Confucian ideology was very much there, despite the fact that an important change was introduced during the later Qing period. In the earlier period, there were a large number of officials in localities, in regions, or in provinces, which are superfluous. Now, all these were abolished. Officials were dismissed, they were abolished, whole system was abolished. And in 1906, the imperial government promised a constitutional government. There should be a constitutional government, again on the Western model. And the plan was to move gradually towards a full-fledged parliamentary system by first developing provincial assemblies and then a national assembly with powers of discussion, with powers of advice. As a matter of fact, in August 1908, a 9-year program of constitutional reform, quote unquote, that was promulgated. But the fact is that in November, same year, both Tzu-hsi, Empress dowager Tzu-hsi, and the imprisoned emperor Guangxu was imprisoned because of his support to the reform movement of 1898. Both of them died. And so after their death, it became clear, particularly in 1910, it became clear that all attempts at reform had failed. The Peking government also introduced another measure. It introduced a system of nationalization of the railways and their transfer of ownership to the foreign powers. Now, this definitely affected provincial interests. So there was much public outcry from the provinces. And it was Sun Yat-sen took advantage of this crisis, the all-round crisis. And he gave leadership in a revolution under his society, Tung Meng Hui, or Revolutionary Brotherhood, which put an end to Manchu rule in 1911.
So, in your opinion, why were these judicial changes necessary?
The whole administrative setup uh, catered to the interests of the feudal society. It was a age-old system. Now, from the second half of the 19th century, as a result of the interaction of the Western powers, modernization or so-called modernization, introduction of Western science, etc., and of course the pressure from the Western powers, all these factors were there. Now, it was felt that changes should be introduced in many sectors because changes in the judicial system, as also in other systems, it was an essential part of the modernization process. And the old system, the outmoded system of torture, primitive level of torture, barbarian torture, naturally that did not fit into the modern pattern, they felt. And that is the reason why they felt that changes should be all embracing, not just in army or police force, etc. And of course, the changes in the judicial system was integrally connected with changes in the police system also. There are two diametrically opposite viewpoints. We have the American scholar Fairbank, who says that the reform measures were fairly extensive, which embraced large areas, economic, political, and cultural matters, no doubt. The other view is expressed by Tzu-hsi, a Soviet scholar, who says that apart from the army reform, all other reforms were partial. These were not done seriously enough, radically enough. These are all partial reforms, half-heartedly carried out. A huge amount of money was invested, and corruption was rampant among the Manchu ruling clique. And so money was definitely not properly utilized. As a matter of fact, the court's reforms came only too late. One can argue that if during the time of the reform movement of 1898, it was a popular movement, coming from above, no doubt, but it was there was a social need that was felt by the people, sections of the people, and they wanted to introduce many things, modernization. But that was not allowed, and they were punished. So if these reforms were undertaken, it would have helped the tottering Manchu rule to some extent, at least for the time being, to consolidate its position for the time being. But after the Manchu rulers' humiliating surrender to foreign powers in 1901, that is Protocol of 1901, the new policy was taken as a sign of weakness. If a modernization was to take place on a feudal basis, the first thing that was necessary was to do away with feudalism, to introduce land to the tiller program, to do away with foreign control, which was very much there. Even if China was not a colony proper, China became a colony when Japan captured a part of China after 1931. But even if China was not a proper colony proper, though influence was there, extraction was there, we know. So if it has to be anti-feudal and anti-imperialist in character, and they should, the Chinese capitalists, the national capitalists, not the competitor section, because they tied up with foreign powers, and if they could adopt a policy of self-reliance, then there could have been a full-blooded development of capitalism. But nothing was done, and that is the reason why later Ching reforms, these were doomed to fail.
The reforms of 1901 to 1908, also known as the Later Ching Reforms, were introduced by the Empress Dowager Tzu-hsi and her ruling clique. The steady Western penetration into China in the years following the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 and a series of subsequent humiliating treaties with foreign capitalist countries exacerbated the social economic crisis and united all social classes and groups into a state of seething unrest against Manchu or Qing rule. The reforms constituted an attempt to save the imperial regime from inevitable doom by offering concessions to the new intelligentsia. The reforms embraced such fields as foreign affairs, judiciary, police forces, army, commerce, and education. The declared objective was to modernize the country along Western lines to meet the growing needs of the time. However, a modernization carried without destroying the old feudal bases and without getting rid of imperialist control was doomed to fail from the start and only accelerated the crisis that enabled Sun Yat-sen to initiate the revolution of 1911 that put an end to Manchu rule and set up a republic.